It's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Andrew Gosler as today's lecturer. He has a joint position between the Department of Zoology in Oxford and the School of Anthropology. Those of you know other members of the Department of Zoology in Oxford will of course be aware of a rather eminent person who's written a lot on science and faith from a rather negative perspective from that department, a certain Richard Dawkins. And Andrew was telling me that his journey of faith has something to do with that certain Professor Dawkins, and he might be able to tell us a little bit more about that. His background is first degree in environmental biology, followed by a master's in pure and applied plant taxonomy, and then a DPhil in Oxford in ornithology. As you will see, he is also an ordained minister in the Church of England. His research falls at the intersection between ornithology, that's birds, and anthropology, that's people, and puts them in the broad context of how they interact together in the context of conservation. He's also a trustee of A Rocha UK, which many of us are familiar with, and played a part in forming the new A Rocha initiative in Nigeria. And his talk today is on faith and feathers, human rights, conservation and mission. You're very welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for coming. It's great to see. I thought we might have half a dozen people, like I mentioned, sort of 8 o'clock Holy Communion, you know. But I am in the collar today purely because I've come straight from morning prayer. It was in Oxford, so it was quite a long time ago, but that's why I'm wearing this. And as for Richard Dawkins' part in my journey of faith, well, I always say I was brought to faith by the Vicar of Dibley and Richard Dawkins, so a combination of the two. So work that one out. What I want to talk about today, though, is more serious even than that. I have an alternative title for this talk, which is conservation as a human rights issue. And I'm going to tell you a story, and it's a big story, and the whole talk will be this big story. And I hope you'll see how the various bits of it weave together to answer the question of how did we get to where we are, and what are we going to do about it? Richard Dawkins might even play a small part in this. So I'll start with a few things that we're going to have to agree as facts. Life supports life. So I'm an ecologist, so life supports life. There are about 8.7 million species in the world. In fact, we don't really know, but you know, the recent estimates have sort of gravitated towards that sort of figure. The survival of this biodiversity is essential for the persistence of all life on Earth, since through it the climate is regulated, ocean salinity, pH and other Earth processes are maintained at levels favourable for life itself. That is Gaia. The present rate of life's extinction is unprecedented in the last 65 million years. If we look at the fossil record over the last 400 million years, we'll find we are living in the most biodiverse time in terms of species. But the extinction event that we have brought about and are bringing about is unprecedented since the extinction of the dinosaurs. So I commend to you the 2016 WWF Living Planet report, which gives you all the pessimism you need for Lent. And in this report, it reminds us that we have become a geological epoch. We are the Anthropocene, because geological epochs are marked in the fossil record by big extinction events, like the KT boundary and the dinosaurs going extinct and an asteroid. And we are having a similar kind of impact, not an asteroid, plastic, pollution, climate change, species loss, etc. So we are a geological epoch, and of course there are many in the world who want to tell us this is all, I'm wearing a collar, aren't I, fake news. So just to put a political spotlight in this story, but we're going to assume those things are true and correct, and if we're going to have a future, we need to do something about it. So where are we going to start our journey thinking about how have we got to here? I want to take you back to the middle of the 19th century. Not so long ago, we'd have been saying the last century, but the middle of the 19th century, and think about 1872. Many conservation biologists think of the start of the modern conservation industry, if you like, as the foundation of the Yellowstone National Park in 1872, the first national park in the world. Take yourself back to 1872. Age of empire, of adventure, of conquest and progress. And Henry David Thoreau, albeit somewhat earlier, said, "The world is but a canvas to our imagination." Promise, threat, what is that? The world is but a canvas to our imagination. It kind of captures that sense of adventure. Go west, young man. Because 1872, not so long after the end of the American Civil War, and so people were looking west. The foundation of Yellowstone comes out of a spirit that is well represented 100 years later by the words of the US Wilderness Act, 1964, which defines wilderness like this. And those people, the 1870s, saw the Yellowstone as wilderness. And they said, in contrast to those areas where man and his own works dominate the landscape, as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. So to the people founding the Yellowstone National Park, and to the people who wrote the Wilderness Act, best part of 100 years later, wilderness is characterized by there being no human presence. Because the biblical notion of wilderness is much more complex than that. But have that sense in mind. So I went to Yellowstone National Park in 2011. It had a big impression on me, made a big impression on me. I grew a beard after that. Not just because of that. I bought my first Harley Davidson after visiting the Yellowstone. That's also part of the impression. That's my second Harley. But I want to show you a few of my own snaps from the Yellowstone National Park. Geysers, hot springs. Wildlife is dangerous. You'll see big signs everywhere saying, stay in your cars, wildlife is dangerous. Yeah, right. Well, sometimes. Some unique habitats, some unique ecosystems. Sometimes wildlife's dangerous. That was a 400mm lens, so I wasn't at any risk. That was also a 400mm lens. There are issues about overgrazing in the Yellowstone, which arose. I wish I had taken that photograph. I didn't. It's off the internet. It's the only one that I didn't take myself. There are issues with overgrazing in the Yellowstone, which arose after the eradication of wolf. And wolf has been reintroduced to the Yellowstone. And some unique ecosystems within the park were threatened by overgrazing. And I'm going to show you a short video, which I hope will be loud enough for you to hear.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years, that the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds and migratory birds started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
So, I want to talk a little bit about the management and mismanagement of the first national park and think about who was living there before 1872, despite some people's impression of what constituted wilderness. In 1871, there were 6 tribes of Indians using the Yellowstone, many of them seasonally, because the winters are very harsh. But what was the history? So 1872, US government declares the first national park, and it's the first national park in the world. And it is to conserve wilderness for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. So there's this romantic view of wilderness. And the curious thing is that despite having said, well, this is wilderness and we need to preserve it as such, and there shouldn't be people there, they encouraged people to go there. And they encouraged people to hunt there. And so people went there specifically to hunt, a wonderful place that you could hunt. And that, guess what, caused conflict with the Indians, who were not just living there, they were managing, they were stewarding the wildlife. So they had a similar effect, but much broader on the ecosystem than the wolves. In response to the conflict with the tourist hunters, the government said, okay, we're going to ban hunting. 11,000 years these people have been living there. We're going to ban hunting. You've heard of Custer's Last Stand. Look up the history of the Indian Wars. It's all bound up with this. Not just Yellowstone National Park, but this is part of the issue. By 1900, the tribes had all been removed to reservations, and there were myths established that no, there were no hostiles. There were never Indians in the Yellowstone. Because why? Because they're afraid of the geysers. Well, they were cooking in the hot springs, you know. It's boiling hot, they were cooking in them. So myths, lies, all sorts of things. But I do want to put it would be very easy to just blame, and I don't want to just blame because in the East, they had, within 10 years, had the American Civil War, which killed more Americans than the 2 world wars. And so looking west was part of something. Yeah, but this is what happened. And 1903, so after the Indians had been removed, they built the Roosevelt Arch, Gardner, Montana, for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. And we have to ask, which people? So, the age of empire, middle, late, whatever, 19th century, produced 2 overarching tropes for 20th century globalization. And I want to talk a bit about both of these. The first is the neo-Darwinian model of evolution, which, if I can kind of paraphrase, combining Charles Darwin's insights of the 19th century with early 20th century genetics. Life is nasty, brutish, and short. The diversification of life has been driven by competition and self-interest in the need to proliferate our genes. Man has no other purpose than to proliferate his genes, which is a bit tough on those of us who don't have kids, but hey. And the other great trope is the neoliberal model of economics, combining laissez-faire economics of the 19th century with 20th century free market capitalism. GDP growth is the only measure that ultimately matters. Only this can deliver the prosperity that we all crave. The earth exists to serve man and man to serve the economy. And if we put those two together, we end up with a recipe for disaster. But I want to unpack that a bit. So because I am an evolutionary biologist and I teach this stuff, we're going to talk a bit more about the neo-Darwinian model than about the economics. I'll let Kate Rayworth speak about the economics. So here we are, 1830s, Charles Darwin. You all know this, so I'm not going to dwell on great detail. 1859, he publishes his book on the origin of species. And a really key thing that I want to sow, little seed, sow in your brain, is that he takes as the model for how evolution works by natural selection, he compares it to what he calls artificial selection, which everybody knows, which he can demonstrate has been going on for centuries. The reason I want to sow that in particular is that sense of natural and artificial. We won't unpack that in this talk, but go away. Lent is a time of reflection. Go away and think about what is natural and what is artificial. And are humans a part of this? Are we a part of this planet? Are we a part of the biosphere? Are we part of the biome? Or were we parachuted in from some other planet and haven't quite worked out how to adapt to, 21% oxygen yet? So, artificial selection, everybody knows from 1 or 2 original wild species, of which the wolf is one. We have great diversity of dogs. Darwin wasn't so interested in dogs. He got very interested in pigeons. And so you can find a lot of information. He was fascinated by pigeon breeding. And actually the culture of pigeon breeders as well. And his phylogenetic tree, a cladogram of dogs of the wild dog species. So we have this sense of artificial selection and natural selection, and that's kind of how it works. Now, key to Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection was that it was driven by competition. That is, in modern terms, that new species emerged to avoid competition and so to reduce niche overlap. And we have some evidence for that, but not as much as we thought. And I want to suggest that actually that model, that perception of how it might come about, owed a very great deal to the mid-19th century culture from which Charles Darwin came. We will see some other ways of thinking about evolution. And so here's one of our favourite examples. Doesn't involve competition at all, but predation. The peppered moth. The evolution. There's a light phase peppered moth there on a lichen-covered tree, and there's you probably know the story of this. But I want to just chuck in a tiny little bit of theological reflection, because I have been trained to do that, and just chuck John 15:1-3 at you. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. I just want to suggest that in there is a sense of evolution by natural selection. Thank you. I'm going to take a little bit of a jump to a bit of ethnobiology, an Australian Aboriginal story. This is on the back of our book, Ethnoornithology. Tells how pelican and stork once lived together, but they quarrelled all the time over what to eat. So pelican and stork agreed they would go their separate ways and eat their favourite foods. I'm just going to move my microphone down because I think it's... And eat their favourite foods, and peace would be restored. Pelican went to live in the lake and eat fish, and stork stayed on the land and ate lizards. And the first time I read this, I thought, oh, that's a nice little allegory of evolution by natural selection. And the first time I showed it to students, I was struck by something else. What if instead of seeing that process, in fact, I even got a slide of it, what if instead of seeing that process just in terms of being driven by competition, because a theological training teaches you to see the world differently, might we not actually see the diversification of life as conflict resolution? Conflict resolution over millions and millions of years. We can choose to focus on the competition, that's inevitable, or we can choose to focus on the diversification of life as a process of conflict resolution, and it depends on how we want to see the world. So, my last little bit of theological reflection, Jesus said, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not let them be afraid." The next point in the cultural evolution of evolution, 1942. So the Darwinian model gets bolted onto early 20th century genetics with the neo-Darwinian model, summarized in 1942. I do think this word modern is really significant. 1942, this is growing through the 1930s. We know what modernism did politically in the world. Produces the modern synthesis. Now, because it was believed that while the genotype affected the phenotype, the reverse could not happen, thanks to Weizmann's rather trivial experiment in 1892, a fundamental assumption of the neo-Darwinian synthesis was that genetic change originated through random errors, through mutations. So 1976, Richard Dawkins comes along, another significant cultural influence. Thatcher's Britain, 1976. The Selfish Gene, probably the most influential book on evolution of modern times, and justifiably so, because it offered potentially testable solutions to the four big questions of biology: the origins, evolution, design, and diversity of life. And so useful was it, so effective, that he rewrote it many times. But basically the same story. Now, the Selfish Gene focused biologists' attention on genes, focused evolution on genes rather than adaptation, to the extent that now evolutionary biologists, I've talked to doctoral students who are telling me that they're working out the genetic relationships between hundreds of Drosophila species, and I say, and how do those differences, how do those phenotypic differences relate to differences in ecology and behavior? Oh, I don't know. I don't know about that. I'm only interested in the DNA. Well, okay, I think you're missing a bit of the picture. But people focused on DNA, and in 1976 nobody could sequence a genome. Now we can do it in half an hour, and what they found was not only inconsistent with the neo-Darwinists' gene-centered view of life, but also with ideas that had been central to evolutionary theory for nearly 100 years. It's basically, if your model of evolution consists of the socio-economics of the mid-19th century bolted onto the genetics of the 1920s, don't be surprised if you wake up 100 years later and find it's wrong. And it is. So, a few books, really important book. James Shapiro, a molecular biologist from Chicago University, professor of molecular biology at Chicago. Evolution, a View from the 21st Century. In it, he says, page 55, he talks about natural genetic engineering as part of the normal life cycle. And he says, a major assertion of many traditional thinkers about evolution and mutation is that living cells cannot make specific adaptive use of their natural genetic engineering capacities. They make this assertion to protect their view of evolution as the product of random, undirected genome changes, but their position is philosophical, not scientific, nor is it based on empirical observations. Basically, genetic change is not random. And a really key writer in this area, but all of these books are saying the same thing, is Dennis Noble, Dance to the Tune of Life, The Music of Life. Dennis Noble is a very, very distinguished physiologist at Oxford, Fellow of the Royal Society. All these books are now textbooks in evolution and are saying the neo-Darwinian model has some fundamental flaws. And as biologists, we need to be looking at the science rather than anything else. Okay, so I'll move on now to the neoliberal model of economics. And I said I'm not an economist, but I know somebody who is. And this is Kate Raworth. And if you haven't read her book, Donut Economics, do. I'll show you a picture of it in a moment, just to fly that flag. So in her book, so Kate Raworth is an economist, of course, and she sets out a cast of characters, like a play, to sort of characterize the neoliberal economic viewpoint, and then rewrites the characters. So we'll start off with her neoliberal cast of characters. The market, which is efficient, so give it free rein. Business, which is innovative, so let it lead. Finance, which is infallible, so trust in its ways. Trade, which is win-win, so open your borders. The state, which is incompetent, so don't let it meddle. The household, which is domestic, so leave it to the women. The commons, which are tragic, so sell them off. Society, which is non-existent, so ignore it. The earth, which is inexhaustible, so take all you want. And power, which is irrelevant, so don't mention it. And every one of those, as you hear those, you're making connections with all sorts of things. And where has it got us? This is where it's got us. This is her book, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. Isn't it wonderful? We've got evolution, a view for the 21st century, and we've got economics, a view from the 21st century. Amazing how this is the sort of culture, the zeitgeist now. So the donut, what is the donut? It's an attempt, I won't go into detail on this, but it's an attempt to recast global economics in such a way that it is sustainable within the ecological constraints that there are. The earth is not here to serve us and to serve the economy. If we take that attitude, we're all doomed, basically. So our economy has to fit within that. And she talks about the social shortfall and ecological overshoot and climate change here that we're all talking about and thinking about, but also biodiversity loss, are measures of that overshoot. So how does she recast the characters? And she changes the order very significantly. The order of appearance. The earth, which is life-giving, so respect its boundaries. Society, which is foundational, so nurture its connections. The economy, which is diverse, so support all of its systems. The household, which is core, so value its contribution. The market, which is powerful, so embed it wisely. The commons, which are creative, so unleash their potential. The state, which is essential, so make it accountable. Finance, which is in service, so make it serve society. Business, which is innovative, so give it purpose. Trade, which is double-edged, so make it fair. And power, which is pervasive, so check its abuse. Now that would be a great place to end the lecture, but I'm not going to. I'm going to go back to those basic, what I called facts at the beginning, and return to the story I started with. And think about conservation. Top-down conservation, which Yellowstone, in a sense, reflects, embodies, is the spirit of top-down conservation. It has produced, that says 2003, it's exactly the same 20 years later, about 7% of the global land surface is formally protected as conservation, some conservation designation. That is not how conservation can be done, will be done. It's not effective. We all need to be involved in that. So let's look at some real examples. Tropical rainforest is home to more than 30% of all described species in the world. If we said terrestrial species, it would be nearer 50%. But of all described species in the world, about a third live in tropical rainforest. So if we destroy the rainforests, Yes, it affects the climate, but we also lose all of that diversity. And this is an important paper published last year in the journal Environmental Science and Policy, Vertebrate Biodiversity on Indigenous Managed Lands in Australia, Brazil and Canada. Basically, what they found, if I just highlight a bit there in the abstract, we found that indigenous managed lands, so they compared indigenous managed lands, like the Yellowstone in 1871, indigenous managed lands in Brazil, Canada and Australia with formerly protected, conservation managed lands in those countries. And they found that indigenous managed lands were slightly more vertebrate species rich than existing protected areas in all three countries. And in Brazil and Canada, that they supported more threatened vertebrate species than existing protected areas or randomly selected non-protected areas. So if we say after 50 years or 100 years or 150 years of conservation, of Western or post-industrial style conservation, what have we learnt? It's that actually we should look at where biodiversity survives today and ask why. So that's the first thing, where it survives is in indigenous managed lands. I'm going to skip very, very quickly through a little bit of anthropology from a wonderful book that my students refused to read, I think because it was published in 1996. I'm always banging on them about read this, and they never do. But anyway, there you go. I'm talking about undergraduates here, not graduate students. Tim Ingold, talking about hunting and gathering. And I have to say that people who Tim Ingold and anthropologists label as hunter-gatherers absolutely hate the label. They say, we do not just hunt and gather, we manage the lands, we're stewards of the land. But anyway, we'll go with this. That's what anthropologists are, or Western anthropologists are saying. Hunters and gatherers see themselves as embedded within the ecosystem, within the forest, within the Yellowstone, whatever it might be. They don't see themselves as disconnected from it. So he says, they don't see themselves as mindful subjects having to contend with an alien world of physical objects. Indeed, the separation of mind and nature has no place in their thought and practice. And he goes on to suggest that we could do well to learn from that. So a couple of diagrams to kind of illustrate this. Western anthropologists grappling with the notion of nature and culture as separate things. So we actually have that sense of Western or post-industrial mindset looking at the question of the anthropology and saying, oh, we can't get it. Well, no, because you see through your own cultural lens. If you saw through the cultural lens of those people, you would see the world differently, and that's where anthropology is moving. So to use his term, hunter-gatherers sees themselves as embedded within a system of reciprocal relationships with nature. Now it all changes with farming, with agriculture. It's very interesting. Ingold picks 3 examples from anthropological studies in the Congo, Malaysia, and Tamil Nadu, all forest-dwelling people, and a thing that comes up in common is when they talk about the forest, they speak of the forest as father or mother, because they say it gives them everything they need. They don't have to work for it like a parent. They have that sense of relationship with a parent. Because it gives them everything they need. And what happens, and particularly he's drawing on Bird David's work, looking at nearby cultivators who have a different sense of relationship with the land. By contrast, she says the environment is likened to an ancestor rather than a parent, which gives favours only reciprocally in return for favours rendered. i.e. not unconditionally. And she suggests that this difference in perception is the most fundamental distinction between hunter-gatherers and cultivators. And we are cultivators. And we have inherited that mindset. Of course, we could unpack that for hours and hours and hours, and we haven't the time. But we need to understand that our perception of nature and our place in nature is conditioned. It is not the, if you like, the natural, inevitable way of seeing things. It's not how all people see things. So when we go to South America, the Amazon, we all know that the Amazon is burning, and we know something about the politics behind that. None of us, I suspect, in this room knows very much about the politics behind that. But if we just look at Kayapo territories here, and I have a doctoral student, an American student, working with the Kayapo on a conservation project. When we look at Google Earth, you can see the Kayapo territories picked out. And look at the whole of the Amazon. You are seeing areas where the forest survives is where is the indigenous managed lands. Lives are being threatened. The Kayapo lives are being threatened, and many other tribes as well, by this land grab that is going on. Okay, and here's the Kayapo speaking at the International Society of Ethnobiology. I was there. I took that photo on my phone from the back of the room, so hence it's not great. But speaking about their plight in Belém a couple of years ago. And this man is Chief Megaron, who I met in Oxford 5 years ago. Was very honoured to meet him. And through an interpreter, I asked him, because the Kayapo culture is so bird-focused, everybody's name is the name of a bird, and they can tell you, well, why do you get, yeah, whatever. It's a whole other story. But they are very, very bird-aware culture. And so knowing that, I asked Chief Megaron, what do birds mean to you? And he looked very thoughtful, and he said, when the birds are gone, we are lost. I've spent 5 years reflecting on that and have at least 5 different interpretations of it, all of which I think are valid. But if you remember nothing else from this talk, as I'm an ornithologist, remember, when the birds are gone, we are lost. Okay. Pope Francis is doing his bit. So we go back to this. So indigenous land is one of the places where there is biodiversity. But what is biodiversity? Well, you ask a group of biologists and they'll say, well, it's species diversity, it's genetic diversity, it's, and then they'll be thoughtful and you'll say, yeah, and they'll say, well, it's ecosystem, it's ecological diversity, yes, and they can't think of anything else, which is fair enough, because it was only 2007 that United Nations Environment Programme said, actually, biodiversity includes human cultural diversity. Also incorporates human cultural diversity, which can be affected by the same drivers as biodiversity, same drivers of creation of biodiversity and of loss of diversity, and which has impacts on the diversity of genes, other species, and ecosystems. United Nations Environment Programme 2007. A bit of work done by Bill Sutherland here in, I think, was he in Cambridge in 2003? Yes, he was. Couldn't remember if he'd left UEA by then. Showing a correlation. Now, this is looking across countries, so each point on the graph is a country, and the number of languages in those countries, this is log 10, so it's nearly 1,000 languages. One of those is New Guinea. Nigeria is in there with 400 languages. And a measure of the relative amount of forest in that country. But I want to direct you to these correlations down here. I wish he'd plotted these, actually, because there is a highly significant correlation across countries between the number of human languages and the number of species of birds and the number of species of mammals. In other words, why? Both are measures of biodiversity. and those things that cause, and it comes down to local adaptation. It comes down to local adaptation. That's what evolution is about. So, report in the New York Times, 2007, of the estimated 7,000 languages spoken in the world today. Linguists say nearly half of them are in danger of extinction and are likely to disappear in this century. In fact, they're now falling out of use at a rate of about 1 every 2 weeks. And why that matters is that contained within those languages is the wisdom of a culture which is locally grounded. Contains the names of plants and animals and how people interact with them. And I'm sure being in Cambridge, you'll know about the lost words and the sense of our own culture, if we know what that means, of losing connection with nature. So I want to end up, it's a powerful image. So where else, as indigenous managed lands, where else do we find significant biodiversity? Well, today, biocultural diversity globally has best been maintained in a context of human socio-cultural and religious practices that recognize and celebrate the interdependence of all life. You don't have to take my word for it. I Googled this yesterday on Google Scholar. Just Google biodiversity, sacred sites, 38,000 hits. The internet is full of references. The literature, the conservation literature, is bulging with references of nature conservation happening in sacred sites. And there's a most awesome video about the Coptic churches in Ethiopia, the only place where there is woodland, where there are woodland birds, etc., is around these churches. Sacred sites of all kinds, not just Christian. Sacred sites of all kinds are places where biodiversity today is thriving. And so, thinking about our own situation, and this is the last slide, our own situation and my own research has partly been on the decline in natural history knowledge amongst young people, and especially our students. An average first-year biologist at Oxford cannot name 5 British birds off the top of their head. Until they've been on our biology field course, then they can name 25. And those are biologists. In the wider community, it's way worse. And you ask them to name a butterfly, and if they can name one, chances are it's a monarch, and you say, well, that isn't actually a British butterfly. Oh, isn't it? But I saw it on the telly. Yeah, but it was in New Mexico, wasn't it? But, yeah. So there is a real disconnection, and I want to suggest, and this will open everything to a lot of discussion, I'm sure, that the decline in Christian faith and knowledge in post-industrial Western societies, this country, for example, is intimately bound up with the declining knowledge and experience of nature in the post-industrial urbanized societies. So with that thought, thank you.
Thank you very much. You've provoked us, I'm sure, and there'll be plenty of time for some questions, at least until 2 o'clock, and then we'll break for more intimate discussion together. Who would like to kick us off? Right down the front here. Wait for the microphone.
Sorry. Thank you very, very much for a really interesting talk. You talked about neo-Darwinian selection and divergent speciation, divergent selection. And I wondered, what about the reverse, the convergent evolution? Does that make a different edge on your story, the fact that different genetic sources end up with similar shapes and morphic organizations?
I don't think it changes anything very much, except, I mean, theologically you might like to expand on that and think about it, that there is a sense in which there is a sort of optimum something for a particular ecological or biological situation. And so, I mean, convergent evolution is very interesting. I went to a nice talk about 10 years ago on species area curves. So if you enlarge the say you look at the number of species on islands, the larger the island, the more species of whatever it has. And this was looking at species area curves of rainforest trees around the world and finding that actually the curves were almost identical, that it didn't matter where you were in the world if you were looking at tropical rainforest. And of course, in evolutionary terms, the evolutionary origins of those different families of trees would be quite different, but you ended up with the same number of species. There is a sense in which there is a way in which things work, and convergent evolution is the same sort of thing. You think of the ichthyosaurs, you know, which were from, well, they were dinosaurs, weren't they? But I mean, they looked to all intents and purposes like dolphins. I think the main difference is that one has its tail fluke that way round and the other one has it that way round. But you know, they're doing the same sort of thing, and they ended up looking very similar from different genetic backgrounds. Yeah.
Can I ask you, you took a swipe at neo-Darwinism. Can I ask you to unpack that a little bit more? Are you saying it's all wrong, or actually there should be more things that are layered on top of it than just a gene-centered view of the universe?
A gene-centered view is quite cool in the sense that you can say, as a sort of mind exercise, a thought experiment, what would life look like if we looked at life from the point of view of a gene? And from that point of, from that perspective, I don't have a problem with it, you know. But we know that's a fantasy. Genes don't have points of view. Genes are molecules. To say that something has been driven for the benefit of a gene to proliferate itself or whatever. And I know Richard Dawkins goes to great lengths to explain that, well, that's not what I meant. Yes, but it's what you said, and actually he falls into his own trap so many times. And the selfish gene, actually, since we're going there, what kicked me off, back in 1977, I was an undergraduate, not at Oxford, and everyone was talking about this amazing book, Selfish Gene, so I read it. I thought, oh, that's really interesting. And I was a sort of Jewish agnostic. I always talk about my wilderness years from bar mitzvah to baptism. And I decided after bar mitzvah that actually religion is part of the problem. It's this anthropocentric view of things. So what's that got to offer us in terms of a solution? So that's where I was in 77 reading this. And I thought, well, that's really, really interesting. Genetic determinism. And we all, as undergraduates, got into this way of thinking, which seemed very mechanistic and kind of attractive from that point of view, until you got to the last page, when he says, but it doesn't have to be like this. We can choose to deny the tyranny of our genes and be nice to one another. To which anyone with the slightest philosophical nous will say, well, not if the rest of your book was true. So the seeds of its destruction are contained within it. And when I came to Oxford as a lowly field assistant and graduate student, they probably will come to think they've been harbouring a sort of, horse in their midst all these years. But anyway, whatever, Trojan horse. But I was very interested to see the extent to which that selfish gene mentality had become so pervasive in the culture of the science and actually of the department. And it's very interesting now to spend half of my life in another department, which is equally atheistic, but from a very different historical reason.
Here's a question down the front here.
Thank you very much. Many people have tried to persuade me that in the book of Genesis, everything God created has been set like marbles in concrete and nothing changes. Please, can you tell me how to speak to these people?
Yeah, possibly over a beer or a nice cup of tea. We have to be pastoral because it is, before it was bad science, it was bad theology. So we have to speak to that, and we have to show them how actually that mindset, that mentality, it all happened 6,000 years ago, whatever, is out of tune with the culture from which it came. So I've said my background is I'm Jewish, and my father used to say, well, you know, Andy, if you've got two Jews arguing, you've got three opinions. And it's out of that, I'm allowed to say that, you could say that, I'm allowed to say that. But it's out of that sense of trying to find your way to the truth that Genesis emerges. I will be writing a book about Genesis and about a lot else, and about the symbolism in Genesis. Genesis 1 to 3 are extremely precious in guiding us to a sense of what is and what might be and why are things the way they are. But I want to just give you a little taster, a very little taster. Incidentally, I think that Genesis 3 is an allegory for the evolution of human intelligence by sexual selection and the increase in human brain size. And that's why Eve suffers greater pain in childbirth, because she's got to pass this huge cranium. But that is not the story I'm going to tell you. I preached on Genesis 1 to 3 in Wadham about a year ago, and had some people skipping around the chapel afterwards, which was wonderful. And the story that I pointed out was that Genesis 1, if you take Genesis 1 as God's eye view of creation, it happens over time, it's ordered, it's structured, you have to lay the foundations before you, but it's also symbolic, because there's day 1, 2, 3, you have to think of the menorah, there's day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, there's a symmetry to the text. You have to understand the symmetry within the text as well. But if this is God's eye view, and it ends up with humans created, men and women, equally, simultaneously, as the last thought, right? On the same day as the creepy crawlies and the cattle, right? Don't get above yourselves. You were created at the last moment, almost as an afterthought. Well, we can debate that. Maybe his first thought, whatever. But you were created on the same day as the cattle. Don't get above yourself. You are Adam of the earth. Right? If that's God's eye view of creation, what did we do with it? Well, Genesis 2 is man's eye view of creation. And I do say man's rather than woman's. Why? There are a few contradictions with Genesis 1. So this you can tell them over a pint of tea. A few contradictions. Genesis 1, men and women created equally at the end. No, Genesis 2, there's no vegetation on the land because there is no man to till it. Whoa, how anthropocentric is that? I'm going to name all the creatures and, oh, women. Well, after I've done that, women. And people will tell you, oh, yes, but it's not from his head or his foot, it's from your... Yeah, but nevertheless, it's Adam's rib, isn't it? Right? So there are those contradictions. There's God's eye view, there's man's eye view, and as a result of man's eye view, we never realized we were living in paradise. We never realized we were living with all this beauty, in the forest, with all of that, with all the medicines we needed from the plants. 50% of all plants come from, all modern medications come from plants. We didn't realize that we had all that. We wanted to control it. Well, that's kind of in a nutshell But so it's not saying that, it's saying that the Genesis thing is as much a mentality as it is a story of creation and evolution. It's about a mentality which actually many of the forest-dwelling peoples did not have, and that actually their spirituality, their theology is much closer to mine as a Franciscan than it is to, I suspect, a 19th century Anglican.
Thank you very much. I think our time is up and I have to draw things to a close. Will you join me in thanking Andrew for really provoking us?